I think we'll make a start then. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's agroforestry webinar. It's a bit of an introduction. We've got speakers, Ben Raskin from the Soil Association, who's doing two talks, one on an introduction to agroforestry in general, and then for those of you interested, a bit more about crops and trees together, so silver arable. We've got Tim Downs, who is a local dairy farmer who's doing some really exciting things with willows, and he's getting his cows to browse the willow trees to help with their general health and milk production. And then we've got Tom Adams, who's a local nurseryman and will be talking to you all about fruit trees on the farm. So just a few little bits of housekeeping before we start. If you can mute your camera, yourselves, please, before we go any further, and then only speak if you're asked to speak. So if someone says, would Anne like to ask a question, Anne can then unmute herself and ask a question. We are recording tonight's webinar, and we're hoping to distribute it on the website and social media. So if anyone's not happy with that, you can either turn your camera off, or unfortunately you'll have to leave. And so we're going to start off in a minute with Ben. We have a chat facility. If anyone knows how to use chat, we're going to wait until the end of each presentation to ask questions. And Alison, there you go, will be monitoring the chat questions, and we'll ask any questions at the end of each presentation. So if that's all right with everyone, we'll head straight off with Ben Raskin. Hello, Ben. You're on mute, Ben.
Hang on. Trying to juggle my screens here. There we go. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Excellent. And now I've got to share. Where's that gone? Sorry. Share. And you see that all right?
Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you, Nick, and thanks for inviting me to speak. Yeah, so my name's Ben Raskin. I am head of horticulture at the Soil Association, or head of horticulture and agroforestry at the Soil Association. I also project manage agroforestry tree planting system at Helen Browning's farm in Wiltshire. So it's 1,500 acre mixed farm. And I've been working over the last 6 years and into the future to implement a lot of trees in various fields over that. So some of the stuff that I'm talking about tonight will come from my experience of that, others from other farms that I've seen and research. So I guess the first thing that comes up when you talk about agroforestry, apart from what is it, is the details of it and definitions, and I guess even people that have been doing it for decades don't always agree on exactly what agroforestry is. Does a single tree in the middle of a field count as agroforestry? Are hedges agroforestry? I mean, I don't worry too much about definitions, but what I do, the way I approach it really, I think is whether the trees are being deliberately managed as part of a farming system. So historically, trees have been separated from farming. The woodlands and the forestry happens over there, farming happens here, and we all get a little bit confused where the two meet. If those trees, pretty much every farm will have at least one tree, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're doing agroforestry. And there's lots of farmers that are using their trees or their hedges as part of their farming system and don't think of it as agroforestry. But where it's a deliberate integration, a deliberate management of trees and as part of the farming system, that's sort of tends to be where I think of agroforestry. And the basic principles are relatively simple. It's about maximizing resources. It's about using the best, getting the best out of those things that you have for free as a farmer. So you know, once you've bought your farm, you have soil, and that soil is your asset, and it's sort of free in that sense. So you want to make the most out of that and maximize that asset, I guess. And then, of course, we get free sunlight and we get free water. But we don't always get the sunlight and the water at the time we want them. So we want to try and capture as much of those things when they come, and spread out the use of those for as long as possible. So typically, you all know this, but typically, what you see above ground is what you get below ground. So in this picture here, you can see, if you've got grasses or wheat that are a couple of feet tall, you're likely to have just a couple of feet's worth of root underneath, whereas a tree will have a much larger root system that can spread down into the lower soil levels and make use of the nutrients that are down there, and bring some of those up to the surface for use by the surface crop. So it's that kind of, I think Stephen Briggs calls it 3D farming. It's the idea that you're maximizing much deeper and taller assets than if you're just farming that surface level. But of course, it's all very well getting making biomass from all of those, but you still need to make a profit from it. And one way that these the maximization is articulated, I guess, is around this term called the land equivalence ratio, which you may have come across. And broadly speaking, in this sort of fictional example, you would imagine that, say, you've got a hectare of walnuts and you're expecting 100% of some target yield of that, and you've got the same of wheat. You might think if you just did half and half, you would get half the yield of each. And what tends to happen is you get a little bit more than half of each of those. So broadly speaking, agroforestry systems are often 30–40% more productive in terms of biomass, sometimes a lot more than that. So the system, they complement each other. So any diverse system tends to be more productive than any individual monoculture. But how you make that work in a farming system is not always straightforward, or knowing which combination to take. And there is an almost infinite range of agroforestry systems. Broadly, they tend to be split into two. There's a sort of cropping systems, so silvo arable or silvo horticultural, like this example down in the bottom left at the Duchy Farm in Gloucestershire. Food forests sort of come into that a little bit, which tend to be smaller and more intensive, but less commercial. They're harder to make work, I think, commercially. And then a whole range of livestock agroforestry systems, which are broadly called silvopastoral. So you have things like woodland grazing, shelter belts, browsing blocks, single trees, alleys, hedges, etc. And I'll run through some of those in a little bit more detail. But again, it's all about deliberately bringing those trees in and giving the trees a purpose and understanding the benefits that they have to the livestock or the crop or the soil or biodiversity or all of those other things. So before I go into those types, I thought it was worth just going through a quick recap of, I've talked about that increased productivity, which from a farm business point of view is really helpful. But there's a whole range of other benefits of agroforestry that can help both the farm and the wider world. So I thought I'd just run through those. So firstly, soil health and nutrition. As soon as you put trees into a system, they tend to build organic matter in the soil. So they'll build organic matter immediately around where they're growing. So most plants will pump out sort of up to half of the food that they produce into the soil around them and trade those for nutrients. And because trees are doing that deeper, they're building soil organic matter and therefore soil life down to a deeper depth usually than shallow rooted crops. And then they're dropping their leaves, and the leaves will blow all over the field. They don't just drop next to the field, so you're building up organic matter in the rest of the field too. And potentially, if you then manage those crops, those trees, particularly if you say you coppice them and chip them, you can then add that into the soil as well. So you can even increase that organic matter beyond just the function of the trees as they're living, but they will do that. The other interesting thing I think, particularly for arable cropping, is if you have an area of trees where you're getting no disturbance, where you've got increased fungal populations, then where you do disturb or damage the soil life in the rest of the soil, the soil life is able to recolonize into that damaged bit. So whether you're cultivating it or spraying it, it can recolonize back into that damaged area quicker if you've got lots of areas. Whereas if you've got a massive 100-acre field, that soil life that's living in the hedge soil under the hedges is never going to get into the middle of that massive field. The trees will also, because they've got these bigger roots that go down deeper, they improve infiltration rates through soil. They can ameliorate soil compaction. They'll break through some of those pans. So they can help dry out soils when it's really wet and help them drain. So you get shorter periods of anaerobic conditions when soils are really wet. And then the other thing they do over time is they will shift the fungal and bacterial ratio of the soil a little bit more towards the fungal side. And there's certainly, again, in soils that are disturbed or sprayed with fungicides, we tend to see a depletion of the fungal populations and a shift to more bacterial soils, which for a lot of the crops is not what we want. There's also quite interesting evidence in light of climate change and high CO2 levels, is that when you get these higher levels of CO2, then trees actually invest more effort and energy into building their mycorrhizal associations with fungi. So they actually increase fungi beyond what the normal activity would be when there are these high CO2 levels. There's actually some really powerful stuff around carbon sequestration potentially. So animal health and welfare, this is a big driver certainly for Helen at Eastbrook where I'm working. I don't, most of us, when it's really hot and sunny or when it's really cold and wet and windy, where do we want to be? We want to hide under some shelter, under a tree where it's cool, or where we're not in the driving rain. Animals are pretty much the same. Most of our domesticated livestock species are woodland or woodland edge by origin. And they just love being under trees. It makes them feel safe, makes them feel happy. There's even evidence looking at behavioral and positive interactions between animals and humans, and that shows an increase in that where there are trees present. So just like me, they're happier when they're near a tree. And if that all sounds a bit kind of fluffy and well, we've got to run a business. Of course, there are, lots of good commercial reasons why you want your animals healthy, and particularly around if, for instance, if an animal is out in the pouring rain and it's cold, it needs to spend more energy keeping warm, and therefore will put less energy into producing milk or putting on weight. Similarly, in terms of sun, dairy cows particularly stop functioning properly, in the mid-20s. So it doesn't take long for a cow to start overheating and suffering, even if not showing outward signs of it. And there's a good study showing an increase of 17% in milk production, for instance, where the cows had access to shade. So it makes good financial sense to provide these sort of natural habitats. And in this picture where you can see the chickens, they're getting a varied diet there. They're pecking away. They're eating at the invertebrates that are living in that soil. There's going to be much richer wildlife than there will be in a short bare grass. And there's a really good case study the Woodland Trust have done with chicken producer David Brass, where he put trees in 37 of his flocks and not monitored them against 37 of the flocks that didn't have it. He's a McDonald's supplier, and he saw he reckoned the payback on it was 6 months. They had fewer egg cracking, they had reduced ammonia, the quicker picking of the eggs because the ground was drier and the pickers weren't cracking, slipping around, and reduced feather pecking and competition. So there's some really sound reasons why you would want to try and provide tree cover for animals, beyond just the fact that it makes them happy, which is important too, of course. So moving on to tree and crop health, and we'll cover this a little bit more in the silver arable bit later. But broadly speaking, for the trees, wider spacing reduces, increases airflow, reduces disease. If you include, for instance, if you include animals into orchards, they will eat the diseased leaves and the diseased fruit quite often. So they break some of those pest cycles. And for the crops, you're bringing in, areas of biodiversity. You're increasing the beneficials, the pollinators and the predators, which will, benefit the crop. They might help reduce pesticides and the number of times you have to spray, or if you're an organic system, they might give you some control where before you didn't have. Though, as with any of these things, they might also increase some species of wildlife that you don't want. And some of that has to be managed. Some of that might be temporary as the system kind of matures. Other times it might be, for instance, they might provide a home for squirrels that then eat your strawberries or something. So, there's introducing trees is not some sort of silver bullet that's going to make everything work. It introduces more complexity into systems, but overall, it should provide benefits. There's lots of evidence about the benefits to soils, particularly around erosion, but also around flooding. These are both pictures from the UK. The top one is in the southwest of England. It's after maize on a slope, no cover, and of course you can see the fields just washing off down into the road. A few rows of trees across that field would definitely have slowed that down and allowed infiltration. The bottom right one is not just an out of focus blurry photo. That's actually in the east of England. It's a light soil that's being blown off into the distance. Again, in both those cases, the farmer's losing their asset, either off into the neighbour's farm or down into the rivers or out to sea. The trees will slow down water runoff, they'll slow down wind, they create these microclimates. Within farms, they can increase the temperature between rows, for instance. So it can be up to 4 or 5 degrees warmer when you're in the shelter of a tree. So that can obviously help the animal, but it will also potentially help grass or crop growth in between. There's lots of studies showing that you can bring animals out earlier in the spring, leave them later in the autumn. Certainly we've seen that at Eastbrook, where I know it's a particularly dry year, but we've still got the dairy young stock out on our heavy clay soils in between the trees, in mid-October, which sort of, if you told me that looking at the soil 6 years ago, I wouldn't have believed that was possible. So, it can give you extra grazing weeks. It could allow you potentially to start crops earlier. It can widen cultivation windows when you're going in and trying to establish a crop. And as well as the runoff of the water itself, the quality of that water coming off when trees are included improves. And if you haven't already got it, I would definitely recommend the Agroforestry Handbook, which has a number of studies looking at these sort of increased water quality. This is one that I've pulled out. So you can see sort of typically in a cropped agricultural system that middle nitrate leaching level, and then on the right the typical forestry one, and you can see that the agroforestry one is much closer to the forestry system. So yes, there's still some leaching, but half what you might get from an agricultural system. And there's similar studies for particulates and for phosphorus and other nutrients. And then the final thing really that I think is worth thinking about, because it's sort of we're entering this, or we have entered this period of really extreme weather. We've had whatever the driest summer for how long. When rain comes, we get lots of it, and then we get long periods without. And how do you build some resilience into your farming system? And trees will do that in the sense that they helping to build soil resilience, but they're also building diversity of crops and markets into your business. And yes, it makes it more complicated. This picture is Ian Tolhurst's farm in Berkshire. So he's a vegetable grower. He's got some apples, he's got some timber, he's growing rhubarb and daffodils in between. So, he's got lots of crops. Some of them work, some of them don't. But, most years, most of them will work. So even in a year where something fails, he's got something else to back it up. So yeah, building that resilience into the farm and the business is certainly again a driver for Helen at the farm I work with, and I know for a lot of farmers thinking about trees. How can you reduce your inputs? Can you produce your own fence posts or your own wood chip for bedding? Or there's lots of things that can come out of a woody system apart from just say the fruits and nuts that you might think of in terms of productive trees. So I thought it was worth, I'm sure Tim's going to cover some of this anyway, but I just thought it was worth just going through just a few options. And Nick, do shout if I'm running out of time. But a few options for how you can implement them onto farm. And I think the first thing to say is, and when I'm talking to farmers about what they should do, it's always the first point is to look at what you've got already. Don't necessarily rush into planting trees. Often you can use your existing trees and hedges much better. And this is a slightly extreme example, but you've got a case on the left where that tree is really not delivering very much for the farming system at all, and it wouldn't be that difficult to transform it into something like the hedge on the right. Change of management system, coppicing rather than annual flailing, for instance, or coppicing and laying. That one on the right could be fantastic for sheltering, during lambing, for instance, or providing some browse or shelter when it's hot. And then where you have got a hedge or a riparian, for instance, buffer, looking at how you can widen that. So on the left here, you can see what looks as though it was a traditional hedge, and they've added another row of trees beyond that. And the one on the right is a shelter belt that we put in about 5 years ago at Helen's. Picture was taken about 2 years ago, so you can see the trees are just starting to come up. So again, it's 5 trees wide, runs up along. There's a little brook on the left-hand side that it runs up. So that's giving us some shelter. The prevailing winds are coming from sort of where we're standing, but also protecting the brook and providing that barrier. And the other bit, for those farms that still have some woodland, and typically farm woodlands are not very managed, there hasn't been or hasn't seemed to be much value, certainly in terms of either managing for the timber. Sometimes the conditions of planting the woodlands would have sort of explicitly said you can't have livestock in, but there's certainly massive benefits to starting to introduce livestock into into farm woodlands. I mean, not, I would say if you've got ancient woodlands, I probably wouldn't. Although they, if you're very careful, you can still do that. But certainly some of the younger plantations we've got really benefit from having animals in. This top left one is Eastbrook again, where we've planted what will be a grazed woodland. So sort of mixed native species, and then after maybe 15 years, we'll start to let the stock back in. And you can have different density of trees. This is sort of quite an open system on the bottom left, and allows the animals to move in and out of the shade as they need to. But even where you've got quite dense tree cover, letting animals in can be really beneficial for controlling the undergrowth and for sort of managing and encouraging biodiversity. And it's all about timing. It's about, sort of when you bring them in and when you bring them out. There's quite a good system in Scotland where you get paid to bring them out at certain times and paid to bring them in at other times. So you can do damage under trees, clearly, if you leave too many stock in for too long. But if you get it right, it can transform a woodland. So browsing blocks is a sort of it's an area I'm quite keen to play around with. I got the idea from Steve Gabriel, who wrote a book called Silver Pasture, and he came over. He's an American farmer and writer, and I don't know how much he's actually done them, because when I looked for practical advice on how to manage them in his book, there wasn't much. But the idea really is that you plant an area specifically that you're going to bring stock in to browse from. So we've planted willow, poplar. I'm really interested in mulberry, which has got high protein levels in the leaf. And the idea is that you sort of grow them and almost then bring the stock in to coppice them and then pull the stock out again. So for instance, in a summer like this year, where it was really hot and dry and the grass, had stopped, there was nothing, it would give you an area of really beneficial browse that they could go in and take advantage of. And again, I think the timing and the sort of getting them in and out quickly and will be crucial to making it work. But we're experimenting with that. And then you've got alleys, which it's sort of, I think for a lot of people when they think agroforestry, they think alleys. This is at Eastbrook on the left. We've got our Perry pears, which we've interplanted with willow and alder, and then we've created these sort of browsable rotational grazing paddocks in between. And we've seen a benefit in terms of the productivity from shifting to a rotational grazing scheme even before we're getting much benefit in terms of shade and shelter from the trees. And the one on the right is a younger one at Farm Ed in Oxfordshire. Can talk about fencing in due course. If you've got questions, we spend a lot of time talking about the best way to fence trees. It's all about cost versus risk, and so we've got here we've put in single strand electric fencing, and at Farm Ed you can see they've got 4 strands of slightly more temporary electric fencing. Both systems work depending on what you're trying to protect the trees from. So that's sort of the farming bit. If I've got time, Nick, am I all right for time? I've got a couple of slides sort of just in terms of choosing
You've got 5 minutes left, Ben, so you're fine.
Perfect. Thanks. So as you've seen, I guess, there's in principle any crop or livestock can be combined with any tree in any system, which can be quite daunting. I remember when Helen first said, right, let's plant some trees. We're like, okay, what, we got 200 acres here, what are we going to plant them? But of course in practice your farm will have some constraining factors. There'll be climate, soil, there will be your own personal interest or skill. There's no point planting a load of almonds if you really don't want anything to do with processing almonds, for instance. Or if all you want is just to have some browse for the cattle, then that will be more likely to work for you. But the other thing is thinking about markets. And again, I haven't got time to go into sort of through all the sort of potential markets, but thinking about, on farm, what can you use on farm? What can you sell locally? Are there opportunities for wholesale? And then once you get some of the skills, or invest in machinery, there might be contracting opportunities as well. So yeah, so just thinking, yes, so as I said, so internal on-farm might, so that might be things like bedding, fence posts, replacing feed costs. So there might be local box schemes that you can sell into. Adding value is again is interesting, particularly when you look at some of the tree crops. So that might be biochar, for instance, or it might be making jam from your tree fruit. And then, of course, as you get more skilled, you can start charging people to tell other people how to do it. So broadly speaking, I think when when you're looking at choosing trees, the two main things to think about are really honing down on your objectives and what you want to achieve, what you want those trees to do for you. Is it about shade and shelter? Is it about a new crop? Is it about biodiversity? Is it about carbon? Because every tree will deliver a whole range of benefits. So really understanding which are the ones that you want will help. And then, of course, looking at your site suitability, so making sure that actually what will grow and thrive on your farm. And then probably not a lot of time to go into the funding and policy. It's I know a lot of people are holding off in the hope that there'll suddenly be huge pots of money to plant trees. There is some good funding under the England Woodland Creation Offer, the UK. Mostly it's not suitable for agroforestry. It's good for woodlands and shelter belts. It's not great for agroforestry. There are some bits of countryside stewardship that that can still be used, and there's some sort of riverbanks and watercourses type funding. There's often quite good local pots of funding that you can use. And then elms, well, who knows? In theory, the proposals are looking really good in terms of what they want to support, assuming that they still all go ahead. In practice, how much money will be available, I don't know. Not very much, I'm imagining, the rate the economy's in. My advice, I think, for anyone thinking about agroforestry is to put a few trees in. Experiment, stick 100 trees somewhere, start to learn what works for your farm, how it grows, what you need to do to look after a tree. Do it slowly, look after them well. We're slowing down the number of trees that we're planting, because I'd rather plant a smaller number and have them establish and grow well than stick in 10,000 trees and not be able to water them and have them all die and have to replant them. Which unfortunately is the fate of a lot of the larger plantations. And if we get more years like this year, I can only see that increasing. So we do have, I'll send this presentation to Nick afterwards for forwarding. So we do have a page on the Soil Association website that we try and keep up to date with the grants and funding. It's quite hard at the moment. It's quite a fast changing scene. So and we certainly won't have it all covered. And I say particularly some of those local opportunities that it's impossible to keep track of. So that's me. Thank you, Nick. I'll stop sharing.
Thank you, Ben. What an excellent introduction to agroforestry. And it was really good to see how you made it relevant to most of the people here tonight in farming. So that was brilliant. Thank you. We're going to go have 10 minutes now for questions for Ben. Now, you can either write your question in chat or you can raise your hand using the reactions button. And Alison, who is kindly helping out with tonight's webinar, will facilitate the questioning. So do we have any questions in chat, Alison, for Ben?
Yeah, we have one from Tim, just asking how big a factor to new tree planting is increasing cost of fencing. So
I think it's significant, Tim. And I mean, not just the increase in fencing, but the increase in everything. The trees are more expensive, the fence posts are more expensive, the labour's more expensive. So yeah, clearly, cost is one of the big challenges, for people putting in trees. Although, you get a benefit, you don't get the benefit immediately, but you certainly get the cost immediately. And, mostly you have to take some land out of production to get those trees established. So there's no question that cost is, probably the biggest barrier, along with sort of confidence about what tree to plant and how.
Okay, I've got a question that I was asked earlier this evening, Ben, that I wasn't able to answer. Is Tess there tonight? I think Tess is on.
Yeah, I'm here.
Yes, you were asking about a shelter belt where you were planting holly and cedar and more broadleaf deciduous trees, and there was a definite prevailing wind. On which side would you put the slower growing holly, Ben?
I would put it on the sheltered side.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a real benefit to growing, particularly quick growing things like birch and alder, and again, nitrogen fixing plants as part of the mix. There's a lot of evidence that diverse plantings establish better, and particularly that that if you include a nitrogen fixing trees within the mix, then it establishes better. But yeah, definitely I would, plant your alder there if the wind's coming from that direction, and your holly there, for sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Does that help, Tess?
Yes, it does. What's the nitrogen fixing trees would
The alder?
So alder's a good one. I mean, we've used things like Eleagnus and sea buckthorn as well, which are smaller, obviously, but they're quite a nice understory, so you get sort of different layers. And then, also with the alder, what we're planning to do with some of where we've planted them is to coppice them, so you sort of keep them a little bit lower as well, and then chip it and use the chip to build soil health under the trees and between the trees. So.
Okay. We've got another question here for me, and just asking if you have any preferably costed case studies for the different systems.
No, I mean, this is one of the big challenges, is lack of economic evidence. So when we did the handbook, we had this big chapter at the end around economics of it, and when Stephen Briggs and Ian Knight, who were doing that chapter, went out looking for all of this economic evidence, they didn't find as much as we'd hoped. So there are some case studies. So Stephen's obviously is in the book. But there's very little for the UK, I would say, in terms of costed systems. And that's definitely a challenge in terms of farmers having the confidence of putting things in without being able to see, where it works. So, I can say to you, oh yeah, well, you'll definitely, you'll get 30 or 40% more, more productivity. But that doesn't obviously translate necessarily to 30 or 40% extra profit, because what are you going to do with all of that biomass? You've still got to make it pay. And I think that's why for a lot of livestock systems, the case is much stronger. I think the payback is quicker, and the benefits more immediate. I think when you start to get into some of the silver arable systems, I think the benefits are still there, but I think it's more complicated, and I think it's more risky, probably. So. But there are case studies. So the Woodland Trust have done some really good case studies. We've got quite a few good case studies in Scotland, which won't all be sort of exactly relevant in terms of system, but so there are case studies out there. And again, I can give Nick some links to send round after today.
Great, thank you. Any more questions from anyone for Ben?
Posted. Oh, we've got one coming
Oh,
through.
yeah.
How can we get away from a reliance on plastic in tree establishment? Biodegradable options are available, but a price premium, and stewardship policies often mandate the use of these items.
Yeah, great question. I mean, we really want to get away from the two. So we're putting in quite a lot of new hedging this year on a part of the farm that has very few rabbits and fewer deer, and so we're going to try just double planting the number of trees and not putting any guards on some of the rows, and just sort of hoping that enough will survive. And I know some people have had success with that. I'm hoping that as the biodegradable options increase and scale go up, then they will become more affordable, because clearly they're really expensive now, and for big plantings, not very feasible. So yeah, for the big plantations, I think it's a real issue. You know, I think it's possible just to plant lots more and see how it goes. We've been planting a few trees into sort of groups of brambles and things. I'm quite interested in using, you know, again, I'm sure you've probably played with this, Seth, as well, but you know, sea buckthorn and some of these prickly things around trees to provide natural barriers. We've even been strimming down where the blackthorn's been encroaching. We've been strimming that off and piling that around trees as well to try and protect them. But the reality is, you know, the spirals are still so cheap, aren't they, that it's quite hard to commercially to find an alternative.
Yeah, I think you just covered this a little bit, but there's just are there better designs that will reduce fencing and protection costs, like strips of trees rather than individual or clumps of trees?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's all part of the design. So clearly the most expensive way of protecting a tree is to fence an individual tree. And you know, and then sort of if you can do clumps, they get a bit better. So again, I mean, we're hoping to do a trial with the Woodland Trust around roundel designs where you have yours. This works particularly well in sort of parkland situations where you want eventually a sort of single tree or a group of 3 trees in the middle. So you plant those and then you put a circle of, say, alder and birch around them, and then an outer circle of hawthorn and something nasty and thorny, or possibly even an outer one of willow and, you know, sort of sacrificial circle that is going to be browsed, but with the sort of hope that they don't fight their way through to your precious oaks in the middle. So we're looking at different ways of fencing. You know, and is there a way of actually just some really low cost fencing around that, in sort of in the assumption that you'll lose some of those outer trees? But yeah.
Yeah, I've got a bit of a conversation just going on that Sonia's suggesting that hedge and brush protects young saplings quite effectively, but must apply quite deep. And this in saying, have you tried coppicing 3-year-old hedges to use the woody growth to provide protection for establishing larger trees?
We haven't yet, but I like that idea. So yeah, no, I mean, I think we've got to try all of this stuff, because you're absolutely right. We've got to get away from the, you know, from the plastics. So yeah.
I think we're running out of time on questions there, but some comments going on though.
Yeah, I think. Well, thank you, Ben. That was really good. We'll move on to Tim now. So if you can stop sharing your screen, Ben. And Tim Downs is a local Shropshire dairy farmer who's going to talk about his very interesting farm where he's growing alleys of willow for browse for his cattle. So he'll tell you all about that.
Am I still sharing, Nick? I thought I'd stopped.
I think you've stopped, yeah.
Okay, that's fine, cool, yeah.
Thanks, Ben.
Evening all, can you hear me clearly, Nick?
Yeah.
I will share away. Can you see that? Are we still sharing? It's loading it, Nick.
It's loading, yeah. It's loading, yeah.
It's not good when PowerPoint says not responding, though. And I've
got. There you go. There you go.
It's arrived. Have you got a single screen or?
Yeah, single. If you want to start the slideshow from the beginning.
There we go. There.
Yeah.
Looks good. Thank you for inviting me. And I think you came and saw our trees in person at Down to Earth on the 15th of June. Ever since then, it's been extremely dry. And so deep-rooted plants have been a little bit of our saving grace to access more deeper supplies of water on the farm. So here's the slide of trees outside woodland. We're certainly advocates of trees outside woodland, having done a Nuffield scholarship and been lucky enough to visit America.
Do you want to start the slideshow properly, Tim? If you click on slideshow.
Okay, I'm looking at the slideshow on my computer.
Yeah, if you click on where it says slideshow at the top.
Oh, what can you see?
We're seeing a PowerPoint, but it's not showing as a presentation yet because you haven't started the slideshow properly. Yeah. So if you go on slideshow.
I start from beginning, F5.
Yeah.
Can you see it now?
That's not the not properly. No,
That's F5.
if you click slideshow up the top on the top bar,
I'm seeing the first slide now.
we're seeing all of them.
Oh no! Oh, that's ruined the effect of surprise. So
If you move your cursor along to slideshow.
Yeah, it is on my computer.
Oh, it's, and then click that, and it should say from the beginning.
Start from beginning. So I've clicked on the second one, first one. So I've gone up to the top of the screen where it says start from beginning, start the slide show from the first slide.
Yeah, you click on that.
Click on that one, and that gives me on my screen making.
Okay, we'll carry on like this, but I might have to scroll down the pictures, Tim.
Oh dear! Oh, that's improvising. Not. Can you move the screen, or do I have to move it then?
I'll request control. Yeah,
because I can move it onto the second slide. Oh yeah,
if you can, yeah.
There you go. You've got control now. Ah, technology.
Yeah.
I'll carry on regardless.
Yeah.
So, and hopefully we can get the pictures to show full screen for everyone. So I'm seeing the second slide now, which is trees outside woodland. Especially after our half an hour of training, I thought this would have gone smoothly.
You know, on the top of your PowerPoint, yeah, that's it. Go along to slideshow. Yeah.
Give control, Nick. There we go.
Yeah, but I can't actually control your PowerPoint, so that's the problem.
Are we on the second slide now? What can you see?
No, move. That's it. See where it says animation slideshow review along the top.
Minimize. It worked so well for Ben, and he arrived in perfect time.
Too much training, Tim. That's the problem.
That is the problem.
Yeah. David thinks it might be the Teams, causing the issue rather than the actual PowerPoint.
Right. We're on to go with that, Tim. Carry on with that.
I'll go.
Just do the slides individually. Yeah.
What can you see now?
The farm.
The farm, and then aims. Has it moved to the next slide?
No.
No.
Oh, that's frustrating. That is. So next slide. So our reason for getting involved with trees was to see whether we could increase the area of the farm by planting trees that the cows would graze in situ, would provide minerals, would provide shelter, would provide shade, and importantly improve the health of the animals and also retain moisture and nutrients on farm. And then ultimately, if they didn't work, to provide fuel for a small biomass boiler we've got on farm. There we go. Allow control for Nick. I think it's my computer, my end. Now
you might want to try Teams. When you click share, are you sharing just the presentation or sharing what it shows like on your desktop?
I've got an arrow with TD on it, and I can't move the slides at all now. So
Sorry.
Shall I stop presenting and start again? Or is that going to waste too much time?
If you want to unshare your screen, Tim, and try and start again, yeah.
Yeah, stop presenting, cancel control. Oh, that looks dodgy. Tim needs to re-click what Teams is sharing. Thank you, David. I'll try that.
We're
Presenting.
on Ames. We're on Ames.
Okay.
That's better.
Right.
Yeah, it's
I will. Well,
yeah.
you've not missed very much. Those of you just woken up, so that's similar to what Ben was talking about, and 3-tier farming, which is very similar to Stephen's 3D farming, soil surface and canopy solar capture. So increasing the area of the farm without actually buying more land by accessing a different solar area. So we decided to look at, and these are photos from this afternoon, we decided to look at willows. Willows contain salicylic acid. That was a better example of one on the right hand side. Salicylic acid is the main ingredient in aspirin. Aspirin has health-giving anti-inflammatory properties which work well for bovines as well as humans. So we were researching with Harper Adams and the Woodland Trust about integrating them in our grazing platform. So we decided, with the help of the Woodland Trust, to plant 300 willow trees and then manage them accordingly, and do some research with Harper Adams. So this cow has a rumour collar on it with iron filings in that measures each browsing mouth open, and also has a spirit level on the side that tells us whether it's browsing a tree at vertical level or grazing the grass down at her feet. So we had students stood alongside counting how many cows went to which tree, and then we try and work out why. Too much data, and we're not entirely sure of the outcomes, but certainly judging by the trees today, they have been grazed. In 2014, Helen Cheshire here from the Woodland Trust and Tim Saunders, who ultimately joined the Forestry Commission, did a literature review for us and worked out which trees we also wanted to plant. This is a different trial for native trees that we wanted to involve in the landscape and plant, and they grew exceptionally well, even though we planted them into a bog, it looks like on that picture there. And we're still monitoring those. They're still growing well, and we're trying to work out what best to do with those as an agroforestry concept. They're positioned further away from the milking parlour and on a field that was generally used as a dumping ground and access route through. So we thought we could improve it by planting some trees in a randomised trial and then testing which ones the cows preferred to graze, and which ones suited our growing environment as well. They've all grown extremely well. We have replanted some of the gaps as well, and the Woodland Trust helped us. We provided the fencing, but they provided the trees. And we put sort of support structures alongside, and then the one with the picture on the bottom is next to the milking parlour, because we wanted to provide a TLC, tender loving care aspect for cows that need extra help or assistance for any reason. So those are willow grown in rows. We've done them in north and south direction, north, south and east, west, purely to fit in with the field. And then in 2020 we decided it would be a suitable idea to pollard them at 5 feet high and put them on a trailer, and we ended up with a huge harvest, 6 trailer loads of willow hay off 300 willows. And we were trying to work out how best to feed those in the winter time. We started off by just putting the leaves in front of them, very high in dry matter. We tested them as well, high in protein, and then we ended up chipping them, and the cows ate them entirely, which we were very, very surprised about, but it was a good outcome as well. And this is the example of the willow hay, which was dry, palatable, edible, and very little mold. So on the trailers, you can't quite see, but there's pallets underneath to allow airflow, which I read somewhere helped the preservation of the willow. And animals would graze it and browse it through the wintertime as another browsing crop. Here's some of the mineral samples we did, and working out the cobalt levels, the zinc levels, and protein, and certainly they were positive. And we've got molybdenum, sulfur, copper, manganese, and a whole heap of different data about the trees that we planted as well. So a lot to refer to, but the willow by far and away was the one that we saw as the best nutritional value. Yeah, here's another graphical representation of the willow. I think that yeah, was useful as a feed for the livestock, providing different elements. Were quite low in selenium on farm, and that will certainly help in terms of feeding, and sodium and salt as well. So that enables us to feed them with confidence to the cattle, and not too many nasties in terms of molybdenum or iron. Yeah, a bit of an overview of why we thought willow was going to be something that was useful to add into our farm system, and we're not sure exactly how much they have to graze to add the beneficial effects, but certainly it fits in well if we're after a higher welfare outcome for the dairy cows. And they've grown well. They've suited the system. They're natural browsers as well. And then I planted a few slightly different plants, so monkey puzzle, Siberian elm, ash, and then going down to some of the favourite one is the alder, number 18, as a nitrogen fixing leguminous tree. Certainly suited us very well. And we've planted some sea buckthorn, and interestingly the walnut above that was planted next to the milking herd. Nick would have remembered seeing these that prevent flies, so they give off a pheromone around the dairy. So this is this afternoon's milking going on, and the walnuts are planted there, both for walnut harvesting eventually when they yield some nuts, and also to reduce the amount of biting flies next to the milking pilot, which is working because we get far less problems than we ever used to. Huge amount of benefit from shade, not just shading the school children looking at the owl boxes we planted in the trees. In the owl provide a huge amount of education. So this owl box in particular had 6 owlets in, which enabled the school children to all see them being measured and rings applied. We do an awful lot of hedge laying on farm, and that's something we're looking to do more of with the elm scheme. Finding craftsmen who can do a tidy job is not always easy, because there's less of the craftsmen about. but it's something we want to return and do even more of in the future. Although a lot of our hedges, as we had the Farm Wildlife Advisory Group round today, were very good wildlife biodiverse environments anyway, so we don't have to lay a huge amount, but if they do get leggy, then laying is an option. This was one of the slightly more damaged ones. I've put the two bulls in this field, and they have used some as rubbing posts, partly due to the fact that we've improvised with tree guards, and instead of using plastic ones, we recycled some silage wrap inner tubes, and they're very thick walled, so they tend to suffocate and constrict the trees. We've chopped them all off now, but I won't be using those again. If all else fails, then the trees can be useful for heating. I'd like to learn more about biochar. I'd like to look at different options of coppicing, pollarding, leaving the animals to graze them in the field as well, and whether we can just trim off branches at certain times of the year. So yeah, got a lot of information from books over the years, and this is one that I found about the walnuts, the value of those on farm, and planting trees that will be able to support other trees in the living environment, and providing cover for animals, and making sure that we use good native trees in the right environment. I think that probably is the end there, Nick. A short run through, but if I stop sharing my screen,
Thank you very much, Tim.
That is
a short. I think it was Teams that caused the technical issue at the start of it, but it was worth waiting for, and a very good presentation. Thank you. And I'm sure if anyone wants to come and visit your farm and see it in person, you'd be happy to accommodate that, would you? If they make an arrangement, more than happy.
Yes.
Yeah. It really is amazing, the rows of willow down there, and the cows happily browsing them. Yeah, it's really good. So does anyone have any questions for Tim?
The walnut trees were put in at the same time in 2014, so we should be getting some walnuts shortly, but they were browsed as well, hence why we put all the wooden guards around them. So
I think I was going to say Rosie has a question, but I've got a feeling that's Tom.
That's Tom, yeah.
Tim, have you looked at different willows for their different salicylic acid contents?
So we've planted 3 different varieties of willow, and we source the trees off the Woodland Trust, and also from Bulmer's cider in Herefordshire. They came from their washdown plant that recycles the wastewater. And interestingly, when we've had some experts here on willow trees, what we thought was crack willow in a row and white willow, they're all intermingled. They're very different varieties, all in a multitude. So I have tested, and we have got results for them, but I think they're all fairly similar levels of salicylic acid.
Okay, because I've got something here from Bartlett Trees. It's a plant diagnostic report, and they've measured the different levels of salicylic acid in about 10 different varieties of willow. And the highest on this list is Daphnoides.
Okay.
And I think when I do my presentation, I'll see if I can stick this in front of the screen and see if people can see it. But
love to see that. Yes.
Yeah, it came from Bartlett Tree Experts, and yeah, I've used this table as a bit because yeah, it might be worth looking into.
Yeah.
Thank
there's
you.
also Tim, do you have any of the data from your investigations? Is that available anywhere?
There is data that they've sent me from Harper Adams about the tree trials. I'd have to dig it out to see what the outcomes were, but certainly they were looking at a whole host of different things. So the trial involving the Harper Adams student and the mineral content and grazing or browsing trial was quite useful to show that animals did actually browse each individual tree, but what we could draw from that in terms of which animals preferred which tree and why, I think we were clutching at straws a little bit.
And there's someone else who was hoping to know more about the walnuts and their particular qualities. That's
the qualities were that we wanted a fast-growing walnut tree that would suit our environment and grow next to the milking parlour. I didn't realise how palatable walnut leaves were to dairy cows until it was too late for a few of them.
Okay, it's not really a question, but we've got Seth helping here, just saying the slower growing species are higher in salicylic acid, probably pronounced that wrong. The vigorous hybrids tend to be lower, but will probably bounce back from grazing and browsing better than the daphnoids, etc.
Right.
Don't know how many people are actually able to read the chat, so I'll read these comments out as my part. And the other question is, how far away from the establishing willow did you need to put the fencing to stop the cattle eating the new shoots?
That's a good question. So we put it about a metre either side of the willows and accepted that the cows would be able to reach under, and we did the single electric wire, same as Ben and Helen have done, and that worked very effectively. And until we loosed onto the hornbeam trial, until we loosed the bull and his harem of 50 heifers there, and they decided to knock the fence down and graze all the trees one day. So then we had to replace a few, but a single strand of wire works for an adult cow. If we've got smaller stock, then we'd probably have to put double strands of wire. And I went to visit a farm in East Sussex last Tuesday, and he's used cactus guards, and he's planted or similar number, about 300 trees across the field, but he spent about £15 a tree on these 5 foot tall what can only be described as weld mesh circles with spikes sticking out. You can buy them from Cactus Guards, they're designed for the job, but they're quite expensive compared with a £1.50 plastic spiral or plastic guard.
Is there anything you'd redo for the planting differently if you were going to redo all the system?
I'd probably plant the willows a little bit closer together. So we planted them 3 meters apart, and then the rose avenues would be anywhere between 6 and 10 meters apart, so we could drive a tractor down. I would probably plant more of a hedgerow style. I'd probably roll something like a round bale of straw out to suppress the grass a little bit and provide some moisture. The ones we lost so we planted some in 2015, and the ones that died were the ones that ran out of moisture.
Advertising from Sonia saying that they supply some native grown willow there if anyone's interested. But don't know if anyone else has any further questions.
Oh, I've just got a quick question, or more of a statement, Tim. It's not just the salicylic acid that's important, though, is it? Nutrient elements like zinc are really important for animal health and immunity, aren't they? So are you reducing your cost of veterinary bills or animal feeds at all?
Yes, yeah, I think our veterinary bills are a lot lower than average. We're reliant on a lot of homeopathy and alternative therapies, and this fits in very well with the likes of tinctures and a varied diet. If the cows were only to graze ryegrass and maize, Not that we grow any maize on our organic farm. I'm not a big fan of maize. Then it's a very unvaried diet. But by introducing trees and hedgerows and infield browsing alleyways, it fits in very well with our culture and ethics and agroforestry, silver pasture, whatever you want to call it, is wonderful for the landscape. Provides a huge amount of interest for the walkers. There's footpaths that run near the agroforestry across the back of the milking parlour, past the walnut trees, and I often see them looking. And we've got some medlars growing there, and they often walk past there and ask, what are those growing there and why have you planted there? So it's interesting the local walkers as well.
Okay, just say Ben's provided a link to that Bartlett's in the chat if anyone wants to take a look at that or copy and paste it somewhere. Farmers. Also, Sonia's asking, have you found any tree species to be avoided for cattle?
Most of the poisonous ones would be avoidable. And speaking to somebody this week, he mentioned that there's been quite a few deaths on farm recently from acorns poisoning. Not that you can do a huge amount about oak trees suddenly overproducing a lot of acorns, but it is something to be aware of if animals are loosed back into a field that they haven't been in for a while, and it's a complete sea of acorns. So we've not lost any, but there are people who are quite worried about acorns.
Yeah. Is there a reason why you planted medlars?
Just wanted to see whether I could ret the medlars and produce medlar jam. They're an interesting species.
Okay, thanks very much, Tim. Oh, there's one question from Emily. Are sycamores poisonous?
I had heard that they're not overly palatable, but it was something that came out in the literature review that Tim Saunders did. And no, I don't think they're hugely dangerous to dairy cattle.
Ben says it's horses they affect.
There we go. They haven't killed the cows yet. I thought I was going to go out with the chainsaw then.
Oh, and Sonia's just asking, do the cows like the mulberry?
Yes, we've got some mulberry bushes as well, and they weren't supposed to get to the mulberry bushes, but somebody left a fence down, and they certainly went to those with glee.
There's a lot of people trying mulberry now, aren't there, Tim? And as an interesting multi-purpose tree, really, isn't it? Because it produces fruit as well as browse, doesn't it? Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. No, I think if I was to plant another plantation when we do our next one, it'll be with similar varieties to Ben and more mixed rather than just willow. I think it's more pleasing on the eye, more pleasing biodiversity wise. One thing I didn't mention in my presentation was the fact we've done some earthworm counting between the alleyways and in the alleyways. So in the hot weather a few years ago, 35 degrees outside, we counted 3 or 4 worms in a spade dig in between the trees in the alleyway in the middle of the grass field. And then in the actual agroforestry, we counted 30 or 40 worms, depending on where we dug, in a similar spade depth. So they're acting as a wannabe beetle bank for us, which is very beneficial.
Excellent. Oh, is that something from Ben, Alison?
Oh yeah, sorry. It's just explaining that a lot of issues with animals being affected by trees occurs when they have limited grazing available elsewhere. So sometimes it can be regulated by grazing, sward heights, etc.
Yes, and I think this year has been particularly drought stricken in Shropshire with very little grass. It's green now, but 2 months ago worried about the lack of grass growth, and we've probably made 600 tons of silage less this year compared with last year. So it's looking like a very costly winter. So we'll be grateful for some willow browse once we.
Even more reason to have some tree hay, Tim. Yeah.
Even more reason to harvest some tree hay next week if it's dry.
Okay, great. Thank you, Tim. Right, I think we'll have to move on to Tom now. Tom Adams, if you're there, Tom, could you share your screen, please?
Yeah. Have you got that?
Yeah, we're there. Well, can you start the presentation?
Yeah. How's that?
That's perfect. Yeah. No
Yeah.
technical problems this time. Go for it, Tom.
Okay, so yeah, I'm going to talk about fruit trees on the farm. So yeah, I run a 6.5 acre organic fruit tree nursery on the North Wales, North Shropshire borders. We've set it up as an agroforestry regenerative system, and we've set up alley cropping. We've planted a lot of willows, and we've planted some native broadleaf coppice. The idea being that we're self-sufficient in our own wood chip that becomes a mulch, which is, it has many benefits in terms of suppressing weeds, feeding the soil, retaining moisture, and yeah, so we're about to start coppicing for the first time after 2 years of willow growth. It's a very diverse site that we've got. There's other growing businesses that work on the site. We have a rotation. The idea is that we don't plant apple trees in the same block for 7 years, and that's to combat specific apple replant disease. If you plant apple trees in the same place year on year, they get smaller and smaller. So we have a 7-year rotation, and within that rotation, we grow green manures as a soil improver. We have a chamomile tea business, we have a cut flower business, and we have a veg growing business. So it's quite diverse and intense. We specialize in rare heritage varieties. Over the years, I've come across quite a few trees or varieties where we found the last existing tree, and we've rescued quite a few varieties from extinction. And the one on the right of this picture is Fringewood Pippin. And I sell my trees to a range of different customers, from anyone who wants one tree all the way through to small scale commercial orchards. So yeah, we're going to talk about the environmental and financial benefits of fruit trees. We'll have a look at my site, and then I'll talk about how to incorporate fruit trees into farms by looking at different styles of growing and the practicalities, and then any questions at the end. But yeah, just to talk about traditional orchards, with farms, we've had orchards on farms for hundreds of years. And this is one way that agroforestry has been practiced in Britain for hundreds of years. Most farms had at least a small orchard, and that was for on-farm use, quite often to make cider to pay the workers with. But the orchard would always be close to the house, always close to the farmhouse, and it would be a space for lambing or for nursing sick animals. And that just goes to show how useful trees are in a farm system. It's that shelter that they produce is so necessary. So yeah, a traditional orchard has been how agroforestry has been used in Britain for a long time. So the environmental benefits of having trees on your site, some of this has been mentioned before and will probably be mentioned again, but they're good, strong points. You know, trees create soil stabilization and soil health. Like Ben mentioned earlier, you know, there's a lot going on in the root zone, and that creates in the root zone there's more activity going on, which helps with soil health. Trees will help reduce the risk of erosion. It'll improve water infiltration and reduce flood and runoff risk. It's great for carbon sequestration. Any trees that you put on your farm will act as a windbreak. And yeah, shade, and the trees create shade and shelter. And again, as was mentioned before, there's evidence that shows higher milk production in cows and larger birth weight in calves if they have access to shade. The trees also act as wildlife corridors, and they're great for pollinators. Yeah, great for increasing biodiversity on the farm. If you're planting fruit trees, then there's great financial benefits to be had from there. Whether you're selling the raw products, just the fruit themselves, or if you're adding value to them by making cider or apple juice or perry or jams or fruit leathers, etc. You'll come across, if you see this website here down in Totnes, they're experimenting, or the farms are experimenting with renting out their alleys to people to manage the alleys, because managing trees isn't, I guess not every farmer wants to be managing trees or understands how to manage trees. But one way of integrating trees into the farm is to perhaps rent out your alleys to other people. You could be renting out rows of trees or rows of coppice or rows of timber to other people that can manage them. And there's great long-term whole farm benefits for having trees on site. You create a more stable growing environment. As we mentioned before, there's the trees act as a windbreak and soil, water infiltration. It slows down the water flowing through the soil. You get less nutrient leaching. You'll increase your product diversity by having fruit trees on the farm. More strings to your bow. If you've got trees on site, it will shore up resilience in periods of extreme climatic conditions. So you're not putting all your eggs in one basket. And again, as was mentioned before, the trees are deeper rooted than a lot of shallower crops, so they can access water or moisture in drier conditions. It can be a point of interest for farms and smallholders wanting to grow their public-facing offering, such as pick your own, juicing, or apple days, or other farm events. And that's particularly applicable if you're growing heritage varieties. There's always a good story behind heritage varieties celebrating local distinctiveness. And orchards also complement apiculture, and honey is a good high-value product. So we'll talk about my site. It's a 6.5 acre site, and we run our rows north to south. You can see we've got a coppice followed by cropping space, coppice, cropping space, coppice, cropping space, and so it goes on. And the coppices are mostly made up of willow. We've got 3 blocks of willow. And again, I've selected willow because it's fast growing. We get a lot of biomass from it, and we can chip it and mulch our trees with. And so back to the salicylic acid, it's also useful for me, and it's useful from a fruit tree growing perspective. because the salicylic acid can leach out of the wood chip into the soil, and that can help combat scab, which is one of the most prevalent diseases in apples. So it's proving to be really useful in many different ways. And I've got a list here of different willows. I think Ben has shared the link to this. Lots of different willows with different levels of salicylic acid. So, for example, we grow Viminalis. It's great from a biomass point of view, really fast growing, gives us loads of wood chip, but really low in salicylic acid. On the other hand, there's Daphnoides, which is quite a slow growing willow, but is very high in salicylic acid. And we've got everything, well, quite a few in between there as well. And also some of our coppices are made up of native broadleaf, just to add diversity to the space, and also to add diversity of nutrients to the wood chip, because the wood chip has different nutrient levels. So we're not just relying on the willow. And then all our cropping spaces are where we rotate the veg, the chamomile, the nursery stock, veg, the chamomile, and the cut flowers. And I think this system can be run, it could be run out on any scale. It could be smaller, it could be larger, it could be on 100 acres, 200 acres. So yeah, we use the wood chip to mulch our orchard and to mulch the nursery stock, and we find that the wood chip lasts really well for 2 years, which is how long our nursery stock is in the ground for. And we need to do very little weeding. You can see the picture on the right. That's a row of nursery trees, and yeah, we might get some docks and some dandelion come through, but very little. It works as a really good weed suppressant. And this is our orchard. So we've started planting. We've got a couple of rows of cordons that act as mother trees. And then if you see the picture on the left, you can see a row in preparation. This bed has been sown with green manures for 3 years now, so we're continually improving the soil, in preparation for the trees going in. And this bed's going to now take another row of trees that will act as mother trees. And you can see to the right of the picture the willow coppice. If you look carefully, you can see at the top there's Viminalis, where it's growing very tall, and then we've got Chinese super willow just below it, and they're all ready for coppicing this year and will supply us with our first year of wood chip. We're putting bird boxes up. We're using organic management techniques to help manage the site. We're using nature's systems to do as much work for us as possible. So the bird boxes will attract blue tits. Blue tits eat aphids. Aphids are quite a pest, really, in the nursery. So as well as attracting birds, we're attracting beneficial insects, ladybirds, lacewings, hoverflies. The picture to the right shows an example of how we're intensively using the space. So we've got this flower bed with herbs and flowers that will attract predatory insects and pollinators, and that's just in front of one of the coppices. So it's at the south end of one of the coppices. So it's a southern end. It's a sunny southern edge that we're utilizing there. And if nobody does anything with it, it's going to flower. It looks beautiful and it's great for predators and pollinators. But we've got sage and we've got rosemary in there, which work for the veg people, and they also work for bouquets with the cut flower business. So everything we're doing is kind of useful to all aspects of businesses on the site. So in terms of planting trees on a farm, there can be concern that trees take out land, can take land out of production for grazing, arable or horticultural crops. But I think it was you, Tim, that mentioned earlier, you know, it's a vertical system, and it's a good use of space. And as long as the varieties and rootstocks are suited to the site, fruit trees can be incorporated into the existing setup. And yeah, we talked about the cost of the initial setup, but you get long-term results. So if you're thinking of planting trees, fruit trees on your site, you need to think about, you know, what kind of things do you want? You need to think about your site. You need to think about the aspect, the wind, the frost, the soil types. You want to be planting your fruit trees in good conditions. What type of fruit do you want? Is it dessert fruit, apples, pears, cherries, plums, or cookers, or perhaps cider or perry? These trees are grown on different rootstocks. The dessert fruits are grown on certain rootstocks, perry on different rootstocks, and they're going to all have different sizes. And so you need to think about what type of fruit and what style of growing you're going to use. So the land type and growing style will determine what type of fruit and rootstock you choose. Cider and perry trees are grown on more marginal land and are on more robust and more vigorous rootstocks. Dessert fruit is generally grown on prime agricultural land, and they use less robust but more productive rootstocks. Excuse me, I'm getting tongue-tied. Will you go for a traditional orchard or go for alley cropping? And the system must be well designed beforehand. You know, you've got to allow for machinery and maintenance. And this picture on the right is a good picture for showing not a very well designed site. These are trees on semi-vigorous rootstock, I think maybe 3.5 to 4 meters apart. The trees are only 10 years old, and already the tractor's struggling to get up and down the alley. So things like that, you know, planning really is the key. So there's a whole range of different rootstocks. There's no particular order to any of the numbers. It's a bit confusing, but different rootstocks suit different soils and suit different growing conditions. So your traditional orchard would use vigorous rootstocks. So for apples, for example, it's M25, pears, Pyrus communis or Pyrus Kirschensala, and they'll make really large trees. And as you can see here, you can graze underneath them. More modern intensive orchards use dwarfing rootstocks, and you can see here how like this kind of system could quite easily fit onto a farm. There's probably 2 or 3 meter spacings between these trees, and there's a very narrow alley in between, but that alley can be any width you like to suit your farm. And again, you know, if those trees are fenced off, then you can be putting all sorts of crops down that alley or stock, as long as it's well fenced. And yeah, modern commercial orchards use dwarfing rootstocks that need staking, but they also need better quality soil than the more vigorous rootstocks. This is a picture of a modern intensive orchard. which could be applicable on a farm in alley cropping. There's a hell of a lot of trees go in there. They're about 50 centimeters apart. I put this picture on just to show you what an intensive orchard looks like. But I think, yeah, there's whether that's applicable for an alley cropping system, I'm sure it could be used. Cider orchards, generally grown on semi-vigorous or vigorous rootstocks. The harvesting of the apples is done with a machine, so those rootstocks are really strong, have a good anchorage in the ground, and they can take a good shaking on an annual basis. My orchard at the nursery site, we have a row of cordons on semi-vigorous trees, and the space, the soil space there is only 1 meter wide. You can get a lot of trees in a small space. These trees are planted at 80 centimeters apart. And this could fit quite nicely into a grazing or an arable system, or a lot of veg growers using cordons to fit into their veg growing systems, because it takes up very little space. It's very easy form of management, and very productive. Before planting up an orchard, you want to take a good look at your soil, and ideally have at least 1 or 2 years of preparation beforehand. Improving the soil via green manures, but I always like to have a good look at the site, have a good dig as far as you can, and leave a board over the hole, and that'll give you an idea of how the water table fluctuates within your site. No trees will tolerate water logging. Yeah, if you can leave a board over that hole and just come back to it now and again and have a look, see where the water table lies, whether you're going to be planting your trees into water, or whether there's a hard pan within the soil that you might need to break, whether you do that mechanically or with the use of things like chicory. But yeah, having a good look at the soil is vitally important. And yeah, a good year or 2 of soil improvement goes a long way. It's worth holding off the planting at least a year to help with soil improvement. And yeah, I manage my orchard organically, and so yeah, like I said, we're looking at using nature's systems to do our pest and disease control. So a diverse range of plants and habitats within the orchard will encourage beneficial insects and other flora. And yeah, dedicate at least 10% of the site to creating habitats for birds and insects and windbreaks. Yeah, the more you can get nature to do your work for you, the better. This is a line from a book that I really like. There's an American guy called Michael Phillips. There's a good book called The Apple Grower. This is a great couple of sentences. An orchard is much more than the sum of the fruit trees growing therein. A rich soil underfoot teems with microbial life on which healthy trees depend for both nutrient breakdown and absorption. Herbs and wildflowers provide homes for hundreds of species of insects, some of which directly balance pest populations. So yeah, this leads on to creating spaces for those predatory and pollinating insects. So yeah, you need to create nesting areas and perches for birds of prey. Voles are a really big issue with fruit trees. At my last nursery, it was a very small site, but yeah, voles did so much damage. I think they damaged 20% of the nursery stock one year. So attracting birds of prey on the site can reduce the numbers of voles. Insect refuges within trees can help attract ladybirds, lacewings, and the likes. Nettles, really good. They're a great habitat for insect predators. Wood piles to encourage beetles and other predators. Earwigs are really useful. They can cause a little bit of damage to the flowers, but they will eat aphids. Lacewings, they're larvae. That's it. Yeah, so lacewing larvae, voracious predators of aphids, red spider mite, and caterpillars. So the more of these you can get on site, the better. The adults feed mainly on nectar, so a good range of wild flowers on site will attract them there. And then if you have refuges, you'll keep them on site over winter. Rose beetles, they will also eat aphids. Log piles near the orchard and decaying vegetation they thrive in. Ladybirds are amazing. They do a whole heap of work. That's ladybird larva there. That's ladybird pupae. And yeah, in some places within our site, particularly on the sage, on the block of sage, you can see ladybird pupae and ladybird larvae all just hanging around, waiting to eat the aphids. Blue tits, again, they do a good amount of pest control. So if you're going to plant trees, yeah, we've talked about the habitat, creating a good habitat around the trees to do your organic pest management for you. Then planting and caring for your trees. I mentioned soil improvement. At least 1 year of green manures before planting your fruit trees is highly recommended, ideally 2 years. Planting your trees correctly. It's very different to planting willow, where you can just plonk a set in the ground with no roots and it grows. Fruit trees are grafted. Quite often people will plant their fruit trees with the graft union in the soil. The graft union must be above the soil. You need to think about irrigation. It's, we're experiencing very serious extremes of weather. If you're going to be planting apple or fruit trees, you need to be prepared to irrigate them within the first few years if we're going to have dry spells. But they also need to be really well mulched. If they're well mulched in the winter time, then the need for irrigation is a lot less. The trees need to be protected from rabbits, livestock, deer, the public. And yeah, as mentioned before, there's quite a lot of expense involved in the protection. I find the best protection is to rabbit proof the entire site, which is not always applicable, especially not on a larger farm scale. We've rabbit proofed our 6.5 acres, and it makes access to all the trees nice and easy. There's no plastic. So yeah, we use raymeal chipped wood as a mulch, and this can be created from on-farm coppices or hedgerows. And it's not just, you don't have to mulch just for the first few years of tree establishment. It's also a good ongoing source of feed. And you can see the picture there. There's a good fungal duff forming, and that will make associations with the tree roots, and increase the tree's capacity to get food and nutrients. Just whilst finding pictures for this presentation, I came across this. So whilst we're talking about mulching, yeah, there is an incorrect way of mulching, and that is building up against the stem of the tree. If you're mulching fruit trees, you must think of it as a mulch donut. So a little hole in the middle, so you're not building up against the stem. You need to think about the seasonal jobs. Pruning puts people off quite a lot because it's a bit of a can be seen as a bit of a dark art, but it's something that you learn over time. And yeah, maybe, I don't know, Nick, maybe this Trees Out of Woods project can perhaps try and help people with getting access to pruning courses or pruning information.
That's something we'll have to look into, Tom. Yeah.
Yeah, because I think it puts people off quite a bit, you know, the idea of pruning. But yeah, I think once you get into the swing of it, it's not as hard as it seems. There's a few basics to get your head around, but yeah, I don't know whether that's within the scope of the Trees Out of Woods project or not. You need to think about the costs, the materials needed, and again, you know, elms has been talked about. You know, there's, with this political uncertainty, we're not sure whether this kind of funding is going to carry on, but it seems like trees are in vogue. There's, you know, if there is going to be funding out there, there probably will be funding for trees. So yeah, I'd say go ahead and plant some. Sourcing trees. I know there's quite a few people from all over the country here tonight. So speaking to local nurseries to get suitable information on rootstocks and growing styles and suitable varieties will be really useful. Maybe again, Trees Out of Woods can put you in touch with nurseries and growers, or you can contact me for more advice and ordering trees if you like. Yeah, that's the end of my presentation. Thank you. Have you got any questions?
Thank you, Tom, for a really fascinating talk. And if anyone does get the chance to go and see, Tom is up at Western Rin near Oswestry. It's a really diverse nursery agroforestry horticultural system, and it's really good to see what the full potential of agroforestry is compared to more simpler forms that you might find in what we've seen with shelter belts and alley cropping. And also, yes, I was going to say, Tom is an excellent source of information on fruit trees and has varieties, local varieties for sale if anyone's interested. So do we have any questions, Alison?
We have a few in the corner already. So Ben here was wondering if you had any experience coppicing or pollarding apple trees. He's thinking of trialing it for an agroforestry system.
Well, I've cut them down before and they've grown back. So they will grow back. There is somebody somewhere doing own root fruit trees. So he's getting them to produce their own roots, and he's coppicing. So they're very vigorous because they're on their own roots. And yeah, I don't know how long it's taking them to fruit. So I don't have much experience personally, but they grow back. You know, I have hacked some trees back quite severely in the past, and they grow back really vigorously. So, you know, it will work. They will certainly resprout.
Thanks, Tom.
Okay. Someone was wondering if you had any recommendations for planting fruit trees in a very exposed site, 1,500 foot above sea level. I mean, 1,400 foot.
Well, yeah, there's a whole range of rootstocks, and for apples, MM111 is the best for exposed conditions. It has a very deep, well anchoring root system, and yeah, it's the best rootstock, the best apple rootstock for the most extreme conditions. And then there's also a handful of varieties that do well in more extreme conditions. Things like Ashmead's Kernel, Tom Putt, Adam's Pearmain, for example. Discovery, they're very hardy, disease-resistant varieties and will cope better in such situations.
Cool. Got a couple from John who wanted to know if you still need ground prep with M25.
Well, they M25 are very vigorous and will do better on poorer soils than some of the others. But if you can do ground prep, that's great, because you're feeding the soil. You're potentially breaking up any hard pan if you're using deep tap rooted green manures. And yeah, the more ground prep you can do, the better.
And also, do you compost your mulch first?
No, we use what's called ramial chipwood. There's a book out on wood chip. I don't know who it was by, quite recently. Oh, that's it, Ben, isn't it? That's the one. Yeah,
it's Ben Ruskin. Yeah, I'm surprised it's not pushed that yet.
Yeah. So yeah, we use ramial chipped wood. So we're using wood from trees less than 7 centimeter diameter, and there's a higher nitrogen to carbon ratio in smaller diameter wood than there is in large diameter wood. And yeah, you can get away with applying it straight onto the ground if you're using small diameter wood. So we don't need to compost it at all.
Okay. General question from Emily about, for the purposes of shade, shelter and provision for cattle, which orientation is better for planting trees? You've got north, south, east, west. And is this different for silver arable systems, which you may need more sunshine to the arable crops between the trees?
Okay, well, if I run my trees north-south for better light inception to the trees. I suppose it depends how the stock can get around the trees. I guess if you were running your rows east-west, then the stock can be on the northern side of the trees in the hotter part of the day when the sun is on the south. So perhaps an east-west orientation is better for creating shade during the hotter part of the day. Maybe Ben can come on to that now or a bit later, perhaps. I don't know if you've got any thoughts on that, Ben.
Yeah, I mean, I'd broadly agree. I mean, I think north-south is best for solar gain in between the rows. So they do recommend, if you're cropping, then north-south is the best. But then, you've also got to consider prevailing winds. So for most people, that's southwest, and then sometimes easterly, which obviously works quite well with north face rows as well. But I think in most livestock systems, the light bit is less relevant because of the grass. So I think it's more thinking about wind probably, and then of course you've got to look at slopes and your field, and if you've got a long narrow field that goes from east to west, you might not want to have lots of tiny little short north to south rows. So there's lots of factors. I personally don't get too worried about it, but and probably think more about prevailing wind and light. But
okay, do you have any advice on the sort of spacing you should plant trees apart using rootstock MM106 compared to one slightly less vigorous?
Yeah, well, 5 to 6 meters is good, especially for organic growing. You can plant them closer, and they are planted closer in commercial orchards. It's used for, that rootstock is used for cider trees quite often, and they can be around 3 meters apart. But at that spacing, the tree branches are going to merge into each other. You're not going to get much air circulation, and as a result, fungal issues can build up. And in a lot of commercial situations, that is sprayed with they're sprayed with fungicides. So if you're not going to be using anything like that, then wider spacings of 5 to 6 meters is good for semi-vigorous rootstocks like MM106.
I think I skipped a question from Tim on any advice on medlar fruits and how to use them.
Well, yeah, letting them and making a jelly. There are some that are supposedly edible raw. I've tried them, don't really like it, but it makes a great jelly, good Christmas presents. Yeah, medlar jelly is the best, I think.
Okay, are there any beneficial predators for cockchafer bugs, and any way to encourage them? Companion planting or exclusion of certain species that nurture cockchafer? From Sonia there, you know?
I don't know. I've never had any. I've not come across cockchafer, so sorry, I can't answer that one.
Okay, is that everyone? We're actually slightly ahead of time, but we'll go now. Thank you, Tom. We'll go now to Ben Raskin for a second and final time on silvo-arable crops and trees together. Please, Ben.
Okay, can you see all right?
Yeah.
So, yeah, so a little bit of this will be, I guess, reinforcing just some of the stuff that AI said at the start, and then stuff that we've heard from Tom and Tim. I guess the crucial thing when you're doing cropping systems is thinking about I mean, we were talking just then about the shade and light availability for the crops, and it's getting the balance right between the height of the trees and the width of the alleys and what you're growing in there. So this picture here, for example, is over at Wakeland's well-established agroforestry system in Suffolk, where they're coppicing. I think here it's their willow coppice, and they're growing squashes in between. But again, you know, you can have any width and any crop and any tree, but some will behave differently. So here's a sort of much wider system. This is Stephen Briggs' farm in Cambridgeshire. He had the challenge of being on a rented farm and his landlord's not being very keen on the idea of trees. So he's growing, I think he's on 106s, so sort of relatively not too huge a rootstock, so that the worst comes to the worst. If the following tenant doesn't want the trees, he can pull them out without causing too much problem. And because they cropped relatively quickly, he could get a return within the period of his tenancy. And his spacing here is 24, well, I think 27 meters between the trees, so it gives him a workable bed for his arable rotations of 24 meters. So clearly in this system, you're not really going to get much competition between the trees and the crop. You've got a relatively small tree and a wide row. His main motivation was to slow down wind and to prevent that wind blow that we saw in one of those previous photos. And he's getting those benefits that we talked. Well, Tom mentioned, the airflow, the pollinators and the predators for his crops, building soil, but particularly slowing wind speeds down and holding on to his soil. And he's also got these sort of wildflower strips and grass strips under the trees, so he's getting added biodiversity and soil benefits from that. The other thing to think about when you start introducing crops and trees together is thinking about how you're going to manage the trees and how that interacts with the management of the crop. So Stephen here, for instance, deliberately chose varieties that were going to ripen late so that he could come in after his arable crops. It's no good having something that's ready at the end of August when he's still got a crop in there and can't get the machinery in. So that's another consideration, is sort of making sure that the crops and the trees, however you're going to manage those, tie in. So we talked about this land equivalence ratio. I just thought it was worth just bringing it up again. I think particularly, if you're if you're thinking of introducing trees into an arable system, it's a bigger decision. You've got to take out this row probably of out of production. So and you'll tend to be losing more income from an arable or a horticultural system by doing that than you would on a grazing system. So it's a bigger decision. Often because I think arable and horticulturalists are more used to thinking about growing a crop and processing a crop perhaps than livestock farmers, for whom, you know, animals are the bit they tend to understand more. You know, I often find that it's those type of farmers who go, oh well, no, I could grow an apple crop or I could grow a nut crop, whereas livestock farmers might be thinking much more in terms of, you know, browse for their livestock, for instance. So it's thinking about how you're going to manage that crop. You know, are you used to finding markets for something, you know, edible, adding value perhaps, and then really understanding. I mean, there was a question earlier about the economics of it. You know, sadly, we don't yet have a good range of case studies on the different options. But you know, trying to, I mean, we've planted, for instance, we've planted quite a lot of almond trees at Helens, which is quite speculative for North Wiltshire, but they're growing really well, even in heavy clay. We did do a 25-year business plan for the stuff we put in. But, you know, when you look at almonds, there's almost no almonds grown in the UK, certainly very few organic almonds. So how, you know, A, we were guessing on yield. B, you know, we have no idea really how much we're going to be able to sell organic almonds for, you know, or organic almond butter, or, you know, some product that we develop. So, you know, it's quite hard, even where, you know, so I was looking at yields on almonds, and I was going, well, the closest I can find is Turkey or France, and clearly, you know, there's a different climate, different systems, different soils. So I don't know whether my yields are going to be comparable. So there's a certain amount of guesswork in there, and it's why I think, you know, for those that are less, you know, less willing to take big risks in terms of the tree crop, planting something like, you know, a coppiceable biomass, or, you know, or even a timber tree where it's very long term but relatively low cost and might be quite slow growing, can be an option. So Tom, actually, I mean, Tom's talked quite a lot about the health of the trees and that wider spacing. I'm really interested in how we can use animals more within tree systems to manage stuff. So, you know, how can we use pigs and chickens? You know, chickens are great at eating pests. They're great at, you know, manuring around immediately around the tree. They peck around it, they scrabble at the weeds. They don't do any damage to the trees because they're small. You know, so how can we build these sort of longer mixed rotations? Including the animals. And of course, you know, we talk about silver arable or silver pastoral systems, but they can be all of them, and certainly a lot of organic farmers that are used to having those longer rotations, you know, you can build those rotations in amongst the trees as well. So I thought it was worth just talking about a couple of the limitations or the challenges. And I've actually, I think I've maybe got these slides. This slide is quite interesting. So this is from the handbook that we did, and you know, we sometimes think of, you know, creating a system that is then going to be a system that is permanent, and often that might well be the case. You know, so I think both Tim and Tom are looking at creating effectively a permanent structure of trees around which their other farming enterprise will happen, which would sort of be the bottom timeline, as it were, where you start with these small trees and you end up with big trees, but you plan it so that you have a big enough spacing. You know, Tom showed that picture of the tractor that could barely get down the alleys. You know, in this picture, they've planned it so that the tractor can still get down the alleys even when the tree is at full growth. But effectively, you know, you're losing potentially, you know, and you're losing space in between the trees here. So you might want to think about what you're doing there. Whereas in this system, the agroforestry is a transitional phase. So you've got it with wide-ish spacings, and you might then get a crop for, say, the first 10 years. But once the trees get bigger, you might then grass it over and graze them. And then by year 40, it's effectively become a closed canopy woodland. So sometimes the agroforestry bit can be a transition or a temporary phase rather than the final goal. And in a way, that's sort of what I was showing here. So on the left is one of our fields at Eastbrook. So we've got, as you can see on the right, we've got the Perry pears interplanted with the willow and the alder. We've got this single strand of electric wire to protect them. And although it's mainly been a grazed field, Helen's experimenting with these direct sowing into pasture, the Farm Wilder Andy Cato thing. So you can see this was about a month ago, I think they put this in. They've drilled a crop into that. Now, clearly at the moment, there's no competition from these trees. You know, although they're on quite vigorous rootstocks, you know, it's not going to be reaching all the way out and competing with that yet. Whereas on the right, you can see this established system in France, where, you know, interestingly, they're still getting a crop under those trees. And it might be that as the summers get hotter, the shade is actually an advantage. But you can see they're pruned high. That's to give a long, straight trunk for the timber production. I mean, they're keeping it weed free under the trees, which probably isn't what I would do. But there will be competition, you know, on these trees between those two, you know, where the edge is, almost certainly. So you might sacrifice some of that yield from the crop next to the tree. The idea, though, is that those overall benefits of, you know, perhaps reduced wind speed, better use of water, etc., will compensate for any loss that you get immediately next to the tree. And this is sort of the theory of it. This is where they've done the modelling, and they've actually, I mean, there are some pictures where they've actually dug down in and seen this in practice. So in a forest plantation with no soil disturbance on the right, that's sort of how the tree roots would grow. In the arable agroforestry system, where they've been cultivating to a depth, you can see that the amount of roots is no less. I mean, if anything, it looks slightly more, but it's pushed it down. So, as you know, effectively every time they've gone through and cultivated, they've cut off those roots and pushed the roots further down and then spread out underneath. So, you know, you're making, that point I made at the beginning, you're making the use of those lower soil levels that on the right you're not. So again, you know, we talked about, and there was a question about, you know, the cost of establishing trees. You know, they are expensive. The cheapest ones probably self-cut willow, where you know you can sort of just cut them and stick them in, and maybe not even protect them, maybe just put in loads and loads and hope they survive. Or you know, right up to your specialist nut trees, which are, you know, £25 a piece. And you know, and you want to make sure that you spend some good money protecting them, because I don't want to lose my £25 tree. You know, and the establishment is really important. I mean, I'm, as Tom highlighted, you know, wood chip mulch for me is really the only way to properly establish trees. I think the speed of establishment and growth that we've got from a really good mulch just blows everything else out of the water. But it's not cheap. You've got to get hold of the wood chip, whether you're producing it yourself or, you know, we're currently getting free chip from tree surgeons as well as producing our own, but there's still quite a cost to spreading it. You know, glyphosate will keep the weeds down, but it doesn't give any water holding capacity or soil health building. And in a year like this, I would imagine that trees that just had a herbicide spray didn't do very well. So, and and we talked about the guards and the plastic and all the rest of it. And then you've got the years of management and looking after. If you're in a purely cropping system, a purely certifiable system, you probably don't need to spend as much on pest control, on keeping stock out. Keeping stock away from trees is expensive. You need strong guards and big posts. I would say anyone putting trees in at the moment with livestock, whatever post you were thinking of using, use a bigger one. We've spent a lot of time going back and reposting trees where we should have put a bigger post in at the start. It just seems so expensive, but actually it's more expensive to post, to replace the fence, the post 2 or 3 times. So cost is a challenge for sure. Then just sort of looking at some of the different silver arable systems again, this is, I'm hoping you can see that okay. This is another excerpt from the agroforestry handbook. So you've got a fairly sort of standard arable here with oilseed rape and poplar, so showing it at some scale. And of course, it can be 2 different tree species. So, it doesn't have to be an arable or a horticultural crop. So this number B on the top right, you've got the wild cherry in the middle, and then they've got willow, short rotation coppice on each side. So effectively the willow is the intercrop with the cherry being the longer timber crop. And then the C, the hazel coppice, is similar to that first picture I showed you with the squash. So I think Martin would say that he would have gone for slightly wider alleys in hindsight after 30 years of trial. But it's a great system. And they've got a double row there of hazel, and they coppice 1 year one side and the other year the next, I think. And then this one is Shillingford down in Devon. So they put in trees about 20 years ago, I think. And again, theirs was about wind protection, and getting another crop for their box scheme. So that sort of business resilience that I've talked about. And we did a film which featured Martin at Shillingford, and he talked quite sort of powerfully about how much earlier some of the crops are when they're sheltered by the trees. They're on quite a windy site in Devon. So again, it's just to show that diversity of systems that you can get. But it's all, as I said, it's all about balancing height and it's where I think my question to Tom about the coppicing is really interesting, because it allows you to control the height for different crops. So there's a great grower up in Lancashire who's retired now, but Alan Schofield, who grew for 30 years on a agroforestry system with pollarded alder on a 5-year cutting regime. So he built up this really complicated rotation of crops that he knew did well immediately after the coppicing, ones that could cope with the shade, by year 5 when the trees had grown back, and even which crops did better, so lettuce would do all right even under the 5-year-old trees, whereas other stuff couldn't tolerate any shade. So you can get really quite sort of complex and geeky about it if you understand your system well enough and you've got a variety of crops. So that one I showed you earlier. So this is Wakelands again. This is now potatoes. And again, interestingly, one of the things they found was that having the agroforestry slowed the spread of blight through the field. So whereas typically in a field of potatoes, you see blight come in at one end and just you see it sweep across the field. In their case, with these breaks of trees, effectively the trees mopped up a lot of that blight spore, and delayed the spread by 2 or 3 weeks across the field, which in some years could be the difference between getting a crop or not. So yeah, this I mean, you saw this picture before from me and Tolhurst, but again, it's that inter-tree planting. How do you know, trees are small when you put them in. You plant for that final spacing probably. How do you make the best use of that space in between the trees for the years when they're growing? So Ian Tolhurst, for instance, he's gone for bulbs and short perennials. We've gone for quick growing coppicing plants that we can keep under control. And then, you know, potentially at some point we'll remove them, or we'll just let the animals browse them off, or they might just die off under the peri pears if there's not enough light. So they're you know, they're a way of building that biodiversity and resource while the big trees get going. But you know, it could be anything. You know, and poultry, for instance, you know, you wouldn't necessarily need to interplant because they would just scrub around. So it depends a little bit on your system. I mean, one of the things I guess that excites me about agroforestry is the opportunities for people to build new enterprises and new products. You know, I really loved you know, Tom's thing of renting out alleys and bringing new people in and stacking enterprises. You know, often there's different skills for the different crops. So the one on the right is Guy Singh Watson down at Riverford, where he's got his artichokes in between his apples. This one on the left is our lovely almond tree. You know, so we're now looking, we've got quite a lot of trees that are now starting to produce a significant amount of fruit. You know, Paul and I, who do the work on the agroforestry, don't have the time now to manage it all, so we'd love to bring someone else in and effectively, you know, take over and manage that agroforestry, either, you know, renting it or on a share farm basis, develop something in between the trees as well. You know, it's really, I think it's a really exciting way of bringing more people onto farms, and making them these sort of vibrant, diverse economic centres rather than just single enterprise. And obviously, you know, wood chip, I think, I am slightly obsessed, but I do think there's huge untapped opportunity for using wood chip. So I think, Nick, I think that is all I've got to say. I did think I'd got a few links here which I can send through. There's a little plug for the book.
I knew
We
it'd
do
be in there
have an
somewhere, Ben.
agroforestry. Sorry?
I knew your book would get in there somewhere.
I know. Well, I couldn't not, could I?
It's very good.
I am actually working as well. I'm working on a horticultural agroforestry book with Andy Diven at Cirencester. We're planning to co-author something that I'm hoping will come out next year at some point. But there's a few links, and again, I mean, I'll send this on to you, Nick. There's a few links here. Ag Forward and Athenet, which were a couple of European projects, have got some really good outputs that are really useful. I mean, some of it's a bit European focused, but there's some really, really good information. For those of you that haven't discovered sort of Chelsea Green's stack of stuff, there's lots of good stuff. Michael Phillips that Tom mentioned is one of their authors, but yeah, lots of other people too. And if you haven't joined the Farm Woodland Forum, then do that as well. That's an independent organisation looking just at agroforestry. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben, for another excellent presentation. Do we have any questions in chat, Alison?
I'll have to unmute myself there to start talking through them. Scroll back to the start. So yeah, John started off asking, how do you stop the trees being damaged by herbicide sprays or incompatible fertilizer regimes? You're going.
Yeah, don't spray. I mean, I think you've got to be really careful about wind drift. So I think I was talking to someone who basically said it had reduced their number of potential spraying days significantly by having the trees. So yes, from that point of view, it potentially it potentially reduces your flexibility. The incompatible fertilizer is interesting, because I hadn't really considered that, and I guess you probably do need to be a bit careful. And I suspect it's mainly an issue on some of the sort of more, the sort of fruit and nut crops that might suddenly send up a lot of leaf and no fruit. But yeah, it's definitely something to think about when you're looking at which trees and which crops.
Sonia asked some questions about the almond trees and if they'd cropped yet and the yield, and if there's any evidence for almonds cropping in the UK, because she mentions that's one of the Shropshire agroforestry projects weren't successful with almonds. I think for Peter Aspin.
Yeah, so
successes.
there's apparently an almond plantation in Wales, which I haven't been to see yet. I don't think there's much evidence, is the short answer. Ours have cropped. We picked them 3 or 4 weeks ago. We're very proud of our 19 nuts from our 60 trees. But that's up from 6 nuts last year. I mean, basically, they're growing really well. They're probably the healthiest, biggest trees in that whole field. We've got 25 species of fruit and nut. And the almonds and the sea buckthorn are the ones that are growing the best. They basically, what they need in theory is a warm, frost-free spring and a hot, dry summer, which typically isn't English weather. But the frost-free spring is kind of getting more and more common. The trouble is this year we had that really hard frost in May, and actually knocked any remaining blossom and all the leaf off the trees. So I was amazed we actually got any fruit still. So I'm optimistic that if we can avoid the blossom getting frosted, we can get a decent crop. They do get leaf curl disease, but they seem to grow through it all right. But they're looking great. They've been sort of the surprise, I guess, in a way. And nice to see that walnut fruit after coppicing. That's interesting.
Another question about how far around the trees should you mulch?
So I tend to do about 1 metre. Obviously, bearing in mind Tom's advice about the donut, with the exception of alder and willow, which you can mulch right up to the stem. All the studies that I've looked at, and I've looked at quite a lot in researching for the book, said that 10 to 15 centimetres deep is the minimum depth. We've started going a bit deeper, so we try and do 20 centimetres or even 25 if we can spare the mulch. From my experience, the deeper you can do it, the longer it will last. So because there's a cost to spreading it, if you don't do it deep enough, you might well have to go down and do it a second time, which obviously is much more expensive than just doing a big load once. So we're trying to do a really good thick mulch the first year, get them really well established and growing, and then forgetting about them. And it depends a little bit on the mulch as well. So if it's very green, or if it's from very soft woods, it won't last as long, obviously, as it will if it's from harder species.
Do you have a variety of white mulberry that you recommend?
No, I don't. I'm desperate to get hold of any, to be honest, because I mean, if anyone's got any recommendations of good value white mulberry, I mean, I've only been able to find, kind of ornamental 20 quid in a pot type stuff, which is not, I don't know, Tim, where you got yours, but I'm getting a few from Organic Trees and Hedging this year, but I'm still trying to find. I did try and propagate some of my own a couple of years ago without much success, but no, I don't have a variety particularly. At the moment it's whatever I can get.
Okay. There's someone asking if you've used wool for mulching.
I have. Works really well. We haven't used sort of full fleeces. We've used the sort of daggings, which are a little bit sort of bitty, and then the birds like sort of spreading them around all over the place. So they do kind of get a bit spread about, which looks like it's sort of been snowing or something around the field. But no, I mean, it definitely works, and it's got quite a lot of nutrient in there, so it's quite good from that point of view. I'm slightly worried about encouraging voles under it. So what I've found using wood chip directly on the soil is that we don't get voles. Where we've used mulch mats, and even worse, mulch mats with wood chip on top, we have really bad vole problem. But where we put it directly on the soil, it seems to deter them. So I'm slightly nervous with wool that might encourage voles. But
yeah, I'm guessing this is about mulching, but there's a question about how deep as well.
Yeah, so I think I covered that, didn't I? I said 20 centimeters. Yeah.
Okay. Also a comment from Emily, just talking about spoke to a large nursery recently. He said they were struggling to find markets for the apples because of how select they are with the varieties. They're thinking of taking them out. He's just wanted to know why you think that is, and just cherries are doing okay, and that they're easier to sell on a small scale.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's the apple and cider industry is quite tricky. I think if you're doing it on a small scale or you've got direct local markets, then it's worth doing. I'm definitely not recommending farmers to plant apple trees on the off chance they can sell them into the wholesale market. I think that's a very risky game. I think what happened quite recently is that Bulmers started not buying all the stuff from the UK growers and started importing concentrate because it's cheaper. So they've ended up buying out quite a lot of the orchards in Herefordshire that they used to buy from. So there's been a huge glut, particularly of cider apples. And varieties. I mean, I think it will change, if I'm honest. I think there is a sort of general trend towards sweeter apples and and named apples and things like that, but I do think there's still opportunities for local sales, and I think where people have got their own farm shops or their own outlets, I think it's worth, and particularly some of the stuff like Tom's growing, where you've got a local interest and you've got stuff that is well suited and there's got a story to it. I think there are opportunities, and I think we do need to fight this trend towards bland sweet apples. But it's not, commercially it's not easy, and certainly the larger orchards will not be doing that. So yeah, I would tend to go for stuff that, I think, like anything in farming, you want to grow for a market, and if that market is difficult or subject to fashion, on a long-term crop like a tree, that's really hard. And a lot of the modern orchards, their trees will only be in for 10, 12 years, and then they'll be on to the next one. But in agroforestry settings, you mostly want to be growing for longer term than that, I would say. So choosing something that you can sell or you can use makes more sense to me.
Okay. Sonia wants also to know why the white and not the black mulberry. She propagates some, works easily in moist soils.
I don't know, is a shot. I mean, Tim, you may know, but is a black mulberry not as palatable on the leaf? Or
no, the white mulberry's for silkworms, isn't it? The black, that's the only major difference, I think.
Yeah.
So you could easily grow the black as well for for browsing. Yeah. Okay. That's a good suggestion. Maybe do that as well.
Okay.
Was that everyone's questions, Alison?
Just a comment from Tim about medlar trees coming from the Woodland Trust, and possibly thought there, a mulberry and medlar.
Oh right, so we're all hoping for medlar jam this Christmas. Tim, yeah.
I think we've got one more parents.
I'll email you my address later. Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you very much, Ben, and thank you to Tim and Tom, the presenters, for what's been a very interesting evening. Thank you everyone for holding on till 9:30 on a Wednesday evening. I hope it was interesting for you and not too long. We will hopefully do something like this again at the end of next year, at the end of the project, and I'm sure if anyone wants to get in touch and with any further questions for any of the presenters or anything that you've heard about tonight, I'm sure I can help. So thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Nick.